Never leave your phone unattended. Check your Facebook posts. Or at least put a passcode on there. But I love what you said about me. That's the best part of my day so far. My dad's side of the family lived in Russia in the late 1800s, right around the same time period that Fiddler on the Roof takes place. And it was a time of the pogroms when, like so often throughout history, Jews were being severely persecuted just simply for being Jews. And so Fiddler on the Roof is a delightful movie, but it also shows the dark anti-Semitic side of Russia during that time that increasingly became more and more unsafe for Russian Jews to live there. My dad's parents were able to escape from Russia in the early 1900s. They eventually made their way all the way to Los Angeles, California, and they began to rebuild their lives virtually from scratch. I mean, they literally left with the clothes on their back. They actually lived in a tent for the first few years. And after surviving on scavenging and then selling scrap metal, my grandfather, Louis Binder was his name, was able to start a small metal stamping business that grew into the successful corporation it is today. It's called Binder Metal Products, of all things. I worked in that business for 10 years of my life, and today a third generation of binders is making its livelihood from this company that started over 95 years ago. Almost since our Jewish origins, all the way back to Abraham, we Jews have been a people of persecution and dispersion and have been scattered across the entire globe. But no matter where we went, and no matter how long we were there, we maintained some form of a Jewish identity because of our traditions. In 1948, after 2,000 years of being exiled outside of our homeland, the state of Israel was reborn. And even though we came from a multitude of nations and we spoke a multitude of languages, we were immediately united as one people, almost like never been apart, because of one thing. What is it? Tradition. And so people in the world affectionately call us the people of the book, and the first sentence that many Jewish children are taught is Torah ziva lanu Moshe morasha kehelat Yaakov, and it means Torah was commanded to us through Moses, and it is the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. In other words, the Torah is the foundation of life for all Jews. And of course, because of our ancient traditions, I don't think we could go on any further without watching this famous clip from Fiddler on the Roof.
And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition! 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 Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Unorthodox, we have traditions for everything. How to sleep, how to eat, how to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Day and night must
So we've been going through a series in the book of Mark, and we've been looking at this gospel with a twist of where the characters in these stories are surprised by what's taking place. And today, our story is found in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. If you have a Bible you want to look on. The title of this message is Surprised by an Unorthodox Messiah. So it's a little bit long. Let's read it together so we can all kind of keep in it. Let's just read it together out loud. It'll be up on the screen. Here we go. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as washing the cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules.' You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your mother and father,' and anyone who curses their mother and father is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father and mother is Corban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their mother or father. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Wow. Oi, 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 oi. So many Jews back in Jesus' day, and especially some of the leaders, challenged what clearly appeared to them to be unorthodox, even unlawful behavior by Jesus, which also led them to challenge his claim that he was the promised Messiah. Their argument was that the real Messiah would never violate even one single teaching of the Torah. And many Christians reconciled Jesus' apparent lawless behavior by saying that, well, it doesn't really present a problem for us because Jesus came to put away with the law anyways. But I think that one of the most important questions that needs to be asked is this: did Jesus ever break even one of the Mosaic commandments? In the 1950s, an important radio broadcast dialogue took place between a Catholic priest named Hans Kung and Orthodox Jewish theologian named Pinchas Lapid. And that dialogue was published into a book in 1977 titled Brother or Lord. Great read. If you want to read it, you can get it on Amazon. And even though Lapid, he was an Orthodox Jew, he didn't believe Jesus was the promised Messiah. He was a serious student of the New Testament. When he was asked if he saw anything in the New Testament where it looked like Jesus, even came close to breaking a commandment, this is what Lapid said in response. He says, "Jesus never and nowhere broke the law of Moses, nor did he in any way provoke its infringements. It is entirely false to say that he did. I suspect that Jesus was more faithful to the law than I am, and I am an Orthodox Jew." That's pretty cool. Pretty cool. And so today I want to address why there's so much confusion surrounding what is often seen by many as this unorthodox, even lawless behavior by Jesus and his disciples. And in so doing, we're going to be diving into the deep end of God's heart, going really deep here to discover his intent for giving Moses the Torah in the first place. Most Christians don't know what to do about this part of the Bible. It's awkward. It seems so foreign. It's like, so we just leave it alone. And many wrongly believe that it has no relevance in our lives today. But keep in mind, Jesus said this clearly in Matthew chapter 5, verse 7 through 18. He said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear." So when has that happened yet? hasn't. So what he's talking about is still yet to come. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And then he goes on to warn his followers not only to be careful to keep the commandments themselves, but also to teach others to keep them as well. And so let's see if we can figure out what Jesus means by this and how we can align his claims of keeping the commandments perfectly with what appears to many to be a very unorthodox way of doing it. We're going to do this by looking at three opposing contrasts where it appears Jesus is violating the teachings of the Torah, but in reality he's actually keeping them the way God intended, at least in my humble opinion. And first opposing contrast I want to look at is the difference between tradition and the Word of God. Tradition and the Word of God. And in our text today, the story today, some of the Jewish leaders are criticizing Jesus because his followers aren't washing their hands before eating. And you can tell from the context of that passage, we're not talking about dirty hands and hygiene like your mother would yell at you. Wash your hands before you eat. Who knows where those hands have been? You know? But devout Jews did this. This was a purity ritual, so turning impure hands or unholy hands into pure hands. And so devout Jews did this routinely before every meal, and this hand-washing ritual is still practiced today by Orthodox Jews. In Israel, many kosher restaurants have these special water fountains in their facilities, especially so that the Jewish people can wash their hands and do this ritual before they eat. And of course, since we Jews have a prayer for everything, there's a prayer for hand washing, and the prayer that's prayed during hand washing goes like this: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu el netilat yadayim. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has commanded us concerning the washing of the hands. It's an awesome ritual. It's an awesome prayer. There's only one small problem with it. You just won't find this commandment for the general population to wash their hands anywhere in the Bible. Anywhere. It's not there. This hand-washing ritual was only a commandment for the temple priests. But the rabbis eventually made it a commandment for everyone to follow, and the tradition is codified today into something that we call rabbinic law or oral tradition. In Orthodox Judaism, rabbinic law is as binding as the Torah laws, the written Torah laws, which is why the Pharisees are challenging Jesus and his disciples about not washing their hands in this passage. And if you think about it, religious traditions can be meaningful. They're not inherently bad, but they can sometimes distract from the way that God intended for us to live out our faith. For instance, praying a prayer of thanksgiving before every meal is a nice tradition. It's a good thing to do. But it can also turn into a meaningless event if we do it over and over and over and over again out of obligation and not from a sincere heart. The Christmas tradition of decorating a tree and giving presents to each other is another example. It's a beautiful tradition. It's a warm and fuzzy tradition. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But oftentimes the deep significance of the Messiah's birth, of God incarnate, God coming to earth, gets lost in translation, and Christmas becomes more about us instead of about Jesus. And so in this passage, there's no evidence that Jesus and his disciples had any animosity toward the tradition of hand washing. They might have, but they're choosing not to do it. And Jesus uses this occasion, though, to make a pretty deep stab against those who use man-made traditions to avoid, as loopholes, to avoid keeping God-made laws. And in this particular case, Jesus refers to the man-made tradition of saying that you made a financial vow to God to avoid the responsibility of taking care of your aging parents, something that evidently was practiced fairly regular in Jesus' day. So it's kind of like saying, Mom and Dad, I love you. I know you have some needs. I wish I could help. But my resources are all tied up at the moment in a pledge to God. Now, this pledge didn't necessarily have to be fulfilled too quickly. In fact, sometimes people didn't feel it at all in their lifetime. And taking care of the elderly, if you know anything about God's heart, this is so close to God's heart, taking care of the elderly. And Jesus clearly takes issue with this tradition. Ironically, taking care of the elderly is a big problem in Israel today. You can still find, or you'll find desperate, disheveled elderly people begging and even sleeping on the streets as their only way to survive. Talk to Israelis, they'll tell you it's a problem in Israel they need to solve. And so at first glance, it looks like Jesus is violating the Torah in this chapter. However, the commandment to wash your hands before you eat is not found in the Word of God. It's simply a man-made tradition that Jesus and his disciples chose not to practice. It gives us good reason, a good pause to evaluate the traditions that we keep in our lives to ensure that they don't distract us from God's heart, from living out God's heart, even in our own lives or in the lives of those that are around us. And so the second opposing contrast has to do with weight versus absolutes. Weight versus absolutes. You know, something similar about all of us as humans. I think most of us, many of us, okay, have a tendency to look at everything in life as black and white. There's a right way, there's a wrong way. And if you're kind of hardwired this way, it's called an absolute or a concrete way of thinking. If you're an absolutist, then you don't like it when people color outside the lines. You don't like it when people take shortcuts. There are no shades of gray. And because of this tendency, many view God's commandments as a very black and white, right or wrong, no shades of gray set of judicial laws defining clearly what is a legal and an illegal way to live life. But that's not the way God intended for us to live our lives. And contained in his commandments are situations that require us to measure the weight of one commandment or the weight of one situation over another. For instance, God makes it perfectly clear you can't read through either the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the New Testament without coming to the conclusion that we are not supposed to work on the Sabbath. This is a day of rest. Whether you do it or you don't do it, or you believe it or you don't believe it, God made it clear in both Testaments, no work on the Sabbath. And the Jewish sages throughout the ages have painstakingly detailed what defines work. Define, how many steps you can walk before that becomes work, or how much weight you can carry before that becomes work, and so on and so on. In Israel, there are hotels that have what are called Shabbat elevators. Who's been on a Shabbat elevator? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about here. Shabbat elevators, one day a week on Shabbat, these elevators stop and go by themselves. They're automatic, so that no one has to work by pressing the buttons. And so, if you're up like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories high, it can take an elevator a long time to reach your floor and an even longer time to go back down because, it's picking up people, it's stopping, it's doing all these things. Thank God waiting is not on the list of violating the work laws. Well, in Matthew chapter 12, there's a great story about Jesus and his disciples, and they're hungry. And I don't think it's just like normal hungry. I mean, they didn't have a real means other than fishing, and they're not near any lake, so they're really hungry. And they're in a farm, and they pick some heads of grain on the Sabbath, and so the absolutists come unglued and accuse them of breaking the Sabbath work laws. You can't do that. You have broken the law. But Jesus responds by reminding them that there has always been weightier reasons to override what appears to be black and white situations. And so he gives them a history lesson. And he says, hey, do you remember the story? You know, think about your Bible lessons you had as a kid growing up. Remember the story of King David? In verse 3 and 4 here, he tells him this. When his men were desperate for food, they were hungry, and they went into the temple and they ate the food that was consecrated. It was something that only the priests were allowed to eat. And yet, in doing so, they didn't sin. He also reminds them in verse 5 that God gives the priests work that they have to do on the Sabbath, and doesn't consider that to be a violation of the Sabbath. There's another great story. This is, oh my gosh, I had so much fun with this week. In Luke chapter 14. You know how you go back and you read stories you've read, and then at certain times it's like, wow, that something just jumps out at you at that. Well, that happened this week. So in Luke chapter 14, Jesus is having dinner at the home of some prominent Jewish leaders. And at this dinner table, there are other leaders and what are called experts of the law. These are the black and whites. They can tell you what's right, and they can tell you what's wrong. And one of these people at the table has a real serious problem. His body is swelling. It doesn't say where, but it could be everywhere. But it's a serious problem. And so in verse 3 through 4, Jesus, being the provocateur that he is, says to these biblical experts, hey guys, I got a question for you. Let's have some dinner conversation here. What do you think? Is it lawful to heal on Shabbat? I love the question. It's an awkward moment, and it puts all these guys in a very awkward position. And it's another one of those really brilliant moments by Jesus, because on one hand, let me get Jewish here, okay? On one hand, these leaders believe that healing, if I said that because in Fiddler on the Roof, he's always doing that, right? Well, on one hand, God did, on the other, okay. On one hand, it's a very Jewish thing to do. On one hand, these leaders believe that healing on the Sabbath, I mean, they truly believe that healing on the Sabbath violates the black and white Sabbath work laws. But on the other hand, the person who needs to be healed is a friend of theirs. And he's sitting right there at the table with them. Can you see the quandary they're in here? And so at the end of verse 4, it simply says that they kept silent and didn't answer the question. Good decision. Because they're in a catch-22 position. They're going to make somebody upset, no matter which way they answer it. And then I love what happens next. While they're sitting tight-lipped in their chairs trying to figure out how to deal with this question, Jesus reaches across to this guy that's ill, and he heals them right in front of everyone else. And I'm sure they probably thought, what just happened? And while they're still in shock about the whole thing, Jesus tosses out a second question in verse 5, and he says, well, if one of you has a child, or how about an ox, and either one of them falls into a well on the Sabbath day, won't you immediately pull your child or that ox out? It's another awkward moment at the table. It's another brilliant moment on Jesus' part, because the answer is yes on both counts. Why yes? Because number one, they're not going to let their kid stay in a well for what could be up to 24 hours. I mean, he could die, right? And number two, they're not going to let their ox do that, because if their ox dies, an ox is a huge asset for survival. They plow, and they're just not going to do it. And so if they say yes to saving their child or their ox, they'd also have to say yes to saving their friend. And again, in verse 6, it simply says, and they had nothing to say. I love it. Some of you might know Bobby Pruitt. Bobby Pruitt and his family, his tribe. It's not his family, it's his tribe. Attend here. Bobby is a leader at campus ministry, Christian Challenge campus ministry on CU, and has been probably before Adam and Eve. I'm sure of it. And a couple years ago, he was out on his road bike exercising, and he was almost home. So he's in his neighborhood, close by, in his neighborhood, which is just down the street from here, and he fell. I'm not sure, what happened, but it was a serious fall. And he scraped up his body, but he banged his head. And anyone who has banged their head knows that the head, because your skin is stretched so much, when you split your head open, it just goes boom, and all this blood comes gushing out. And that's what happened to him. And so he's pretty hurt. And he hurt enough that he doesn't want to ride his bike home. So he knocks on a door of a home right by where he fell, and nobody answered the door. And he goes next door, and there's a mezuzah on the door, which you know right away, it's a Jewish home. And he knew that there was a rabbi that lived in the neighborhood. And sure enough, when the doors open, it's the rabbi. And it's Shabbat. And they're having their weekly service in his house. And so Bobby says, hey, I'm hurt. Can you help me? He says, well, we'll do what we can. What do you need? He says, well, can you call my wife and have her come get me? And he said, well, actually, I can't. We unplugged the phone for Shabbat, and we can't use the phone for 24 hours, but you can. You're a Gentile. You can come in and use the phone. And so that's what he did. He went in, and no towels, no nothing to help him out. So he's bleeding on their floor. And he called Gail, and sure enough, Gail came to get him. And it's, and honestly, I don't want to paint these people in a bad light, because they did a lot to try and help him, but they were confined to this tradition that some things they could do and some things they couldn't do, and they weren't able to balance the weight of the situation with their absolute kind of way of thinking. And the point I'm trying to make here is that not every situation is black and white, nor does God intend us to think that every situation is black and white. Some situations are weightier than others. They require a rational, compassionate head on our shoulders in order to let our tendency, that natural tendency we have, to be black and white, kind of legalists, get in the way of what God would really want us to do in some cases. And so in all the situations we just looked at in this particular point, Jesus never violated any of the commandments, because the weight of each situation required some kind of deviation from the set of rules. So, you with me on that? Okay. The last opposing contrast is spirit and letter. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3, Rabbi Saul, the Apostle Paul, addresses this idea of the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. And he's praising the members of the Corinthian congregation because they're living their lives in such an exemplary way. And so he says to them, you show that you are a letter from Messiah, written with ink, not with the spirit, not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And then he goes on to talk about this contrast between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And this congregation was applying God's true heart of keeping his commandments, not by the letter, but by the Spirit, meaning that the law sometimes, if you think about a legal system, I don't know if any of you have ever had the wonderful privilege of having to be in a legal system for something, whether you had to defend yourself or prosecute somebody. The legal system can often seem kind of cold and rigid and ruthless if it's simply carried out in a black and white manner, and different judges run courtrooms in different ways. Different prosecutors run the way they think in different ways. And it can be that way if it's not filtered first through your heart. And the best story in the Bible I can give about this is the story of the woman in John chapter 8 who's caught in adultery. And so Jesus is teaching, and some leaders bring this woman and bring her before Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, we caught this woman in adultery. It's a whole nother story to ask, where's the man? Because the penalty for the man is just the same as it was for penalty of the woman. That's a whole nother message to give. But they only bring the woman, and they bring in front of Jesus, and they say, according to the law of Moses, we must stone her. And so Jesus, being the law keeper that he is, says, you're right. That's exactly what the law states. And we have, we should stone her. And so you who are without sin, you guys be the first to go. And you know the story. He kneels down and he starts writing in the dirt, and one by one, they drop their rocks and they walk away. And this is important. The next thing that Jesus does is really important because he says, woman, where are your accusers? Now, why does he ask her this? He's faithful to the law here. He asked this question because it takes 2 or more witnesses in order to prove somebody guilty and go on with the execution. And so, again, he's brilliant, right? He's not trying to disobey the law, but he figured out a way in which he could give this woman a second chance, because when he says, where are your accusers? And she says, there aren't any. Jesus says, well, I don't accuse you either. I mean, I don't condemn you. It can't be off just my testimony. I didn't see you do this. And so in a way, you might even say he's manipulating things a little bit. But why? You got to get to the deeper thing here. Yes, the law said that anybody who commits adultery should be stoned to death. But if you miss the part about this is a human life, this is a person who could be redeemed, this is a person who deserves a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth chance, just like you and I have been given chances like that. And I think the thing to get, at least in this last point, but really it covers all 3 of these points, of whether it's tradition in the word or it's being an absolute person or being the spirit or the letter, is it's important that we filter everything that we believe and everything that we do through God's heart and then into our heart. I think that is so important. There's so many of us that we just want to do things black and white, and we want to see things black and white, and we just want everything done the way that we see things are supposed to be done. But people need to have second chances. Let me tell you about a situation a few years ago. Jesus was once asked, where are we at time-wise? Oh, good, we're doing great. What's the greatest commandment, right? Didn't somebody come up to him and says, hey, as you read the 613 mitzvot within the Torah, which one do you think is the greatest one? He couldn't boil it down to one, right? He has to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. If you miss that, if you don't filter that through every commandment, then something's wrong. A couple years ago, Andrew and I were helping one of our grandkids through a really tough time in her life, and she had found herself in Boulder County's legal system. Now, I understand not everybody has the same experience, but we had what I would call one of the most incredible experiences. Probably in this system for 2 years, several times having to go to court. If your teenager gets in trouble, I'm just going to say this just for us, but I saw so many families that had the same experience. If your teenager gets in trouble, you want to live in Boulder County. Seriously, I'm proud to say that Boulder County dedicates a lot of our tax dollars not into punitive discipline for teenagers, but into restorative discipline for teenagers. And so we had a team of experts and psychologists and social workers and probation officers and family members. And once a month we sat at a round table together, maybe 13 of us, 14 of us all together trying to figure things out. And so we'd have to go back to court fairly often and report in. And we'd always hear like the worst of the cases, that you'd look at it and you'd say, oh my gosh, this because a lot of these kids, they're acting out because things are going on at home that is causing them to act out. And so you'd think, oh my gosh, this is horrible, it's never going to get better. But then at the end of the court, there'd always be those cases that started off that way, but they have to come back and report to the judge. I love the judges in the juvenile system, because it was like watching, Intervention. You ever watch Intervention, the show? Or how about, how about The Biggest Loser? And you watch these stories of redemption and healing, and it's not just about losing weight sometimes, it's about getting in touch with why maybe you put on that weight in the beginning, that you had eating disorders or whatever. And I found myself just like watching these shows, and I'm such a I just cry at Hallmark commercials. But I'm finding myself in the courtroom just weeping like a baby, listening to these stories as these kids would tell that they would say, thank you so much for giving me a second chance and a third chance, and this is what I'm doing today, and I'm in school and I'm doing well, and I kept thinking, I wish every church could do better than Boulder County when it came to helping people, because it's not the case. A lot of times we don't want to give people a second chance, and we're judgmental, and we're arrogant, and we're all those things. And we won't put a team around them that'll be their advocates and just assume that they're going to fail several times along the way before they get it right. And that's what I want you to get across. That's how Jesus lived his life, and he never sinned one time, ever. Never disobeyed one of the commandments, never broke one of them. Because he wasn't a legalist. He wasn't black and white. Sure, he came across hard sometimes. That's what you have to do sometimes. But he gave people chances. He saw the best in them. He was patient. How much more should we be that way? So, Father, I thank you for these stories where it really does. It looks like Jesus is being highly unorthodox, even lawless, and yet he's fulfilling your commandments perfectly. And he tells us that not one dot and tittle will pass away until heaven and earth pass away, which means we should be the same way. We should be able to look at sometimes what looks like really confusing commandments and extract out of it, how can we love God and love others in today's culture? And be an advocate for those who are lost and powerless and weak. So teach us, Lord, teach us that we might have your heart and filter everything through your heart into our heart first. And I pray in Yeshua's name, amen.